Good afternoon. Hi, welcome to those in the room and welcome to those who are participating online. My name is Kyla McLeod and I'm here today with Dr. Frédéric Fovet, and we're very excited to have some conversation and dialogue. We are exploring the changing landscape of disability service provision in higher education. So it's one of our set, and I'm a guest to the School of Education and Technology, so thank you, Frédéric, for letting me welcome and open the session, but it's pretty nice to be part of an ongoing series of SET Presents. So before we go any farther, let's acknowledge that we are on the absolutely beautiful land of the families of the Kwanghan and Kwasapsum people, and it's with great gratitude that we are able to work, live, and play together in a land that has a great history of education, compassion, caring, and community. So would you like to talk through the objectives of today? Yeah.
So hi, everyone. So what we decided to do today was to combine Kyla's experience here at Rural Roads in accessibility and an experience that I've had. So I was director of accessibility at McGill for 4 years, and I still work as a consultant in K-12 and in higher ed. So we would give you a sort of combined view of the observations that we've done and some of the work that I've done. So this it's a little bit of the research work I've done is embedded into that. So I'll let you know when I refer specifically to work and research that I've done. But we hope to give you a good overview of all the changes and then to sort of open a dialogue as to what are the solutions and how can, for example, Universal for the Design for Learning, find fit into this landscape and maybe help us with some of the difficulties that we have in. So we have 3 objectives for you today: provide an overview of the rapidly changing field of disability in post-secondary disability service provision, introduce as a second step Universal Design as a possible solution within this changing landscape. And then we'll look at some of the strategic issues relating to, universal design for learning. If we want to roll it out on campuses, what are some of the strategic issues with faculty as well? Okay. So this is really the part that's more research sort of oriented. So this is the results as a framework for the discussion that we're going to have today. This is a sort of approach on what I call 5 pillars. Looking at 5 changing angles of disability service provision. And this is a result of research which I did when I was at McGill. It really is sort of the qualitative result of ongoing both presenting and then going through triangulation with our audience and actually asking them what was missing. So when we would start these sort of talks to administration, faculty, students. I was there from 2011 to 2015. We would go in normally with one of these points. And originally, I was actually talking mostly about the social model of disability. That's the argument that we brought forward into the room. But progressively, as we delivered more and more of these sort of pep talks, introduction, discussions, stakeholders themselves, so be it administrators, faculty, students, would come to us and say, well, you should really talk about this as well. This is really important. So, I really like the sort of eventually 5 sort of angles, and we're going to propose them to you today as an exploration for a discussion. So I'll run through them quickly, and then we'll go take some time to explore each in turn, and both Kyla and I will give you some feelings as to how we think things are changing. So the first one is resource management. So really looking from an operational angle, what has changed in terms of numbers, cost, and so forth. The second one is the increase, and I would say the explosion as well, of diagnosis and diagnostic labels, and how that's complicated the work that we do in disability service provision. The third one is not always talked about, but I was lucky that while I was at McGill, some good dialogue started happening with the Sustainability Office about talking how importance of looking at overlapping our discourses between sustainability, access, and even social justice, and looking at this from a long term and trying to find arguments to show to people how this might be relevant within even a sustainability lens within campuses. The fourth is one that we can't avoid, looking at social model and how we are as a society moving slowly from medical model to social model, and it's getting more traction now. And the last one, but not least, the importance of student voice, and that students have become their own advocates. They're quite eloquent about changes that they want to see happen, and we'll open that up and see what changes we see there happening as well. So I'll let Kyla start with that.
This is a very high-level history of some of the trends that we've been seeing in accessibility services at Royal Roads University. So we've been tracking our numbers dated back prior to 2010. But for the purposes of this, we would see that in 2010, we would have had in and around 300-ish plus students accessing accessibility services. We're now up to 461 current for this academic year. Now, within that number, within that frame, that does not include students who come and only access us for an initial consultation. So we still have, at any given time throughout any of these years, between 40 and 70 students that come and access support or resources. Many of those students may or may not be presenting with a learning disability or neurological disorder, but because we have short compressed programs, whether it's a graduate certificate program or a student is coming through in the middle of an 18-month program, if they come and they present potential for a learning disability, we can give them a pre-screened self-assessment that allows them to get an accommodation without actually having to be registered for any specific disability. So we track them as students that we have supported with inquiry only, but we don't necessarily have a clear registered diagnosis for them, but they can then request specific accommodations based on a pre-assessment. So the numbers are a little bit tricky for us to really quantify, but what we do see is an increasing trend in the number of students that are coming through and registering, and in many cases that's due to a lot of the movement to destigmatize accessing services, what is an accommodation, and leveling that playing field, but also what does it mean to be learning with a disability. We also, we're going to speak to this in terms of the exploding trends coming through the post-secondary or the K through 12 system. We have a lot more students coming through now with a little more confidence in their agency and their ability to speak to what their understanding of their own learning style is and what their needs are. We also see that as a result of some of those younger generations having access to a different model of learning. They bring it home, they talk to their parents are our students, and those students are coming in saying, my son or my daughter has this IEP, has this plan, and their experience is so similar to what my experience was like in high school. I'm thinking I might need to seek out some support or some resources or learn a little bit more about what is available to you through accessibility services. So we certainly have seen an increase in numbers and also in just basic inquiry into our system.
Excellent. I'll just add a few points. And in a way, Royal Roads is lucky because the increase that you're seeing is still sort of contained. So I now use a similar graph, and I was at McGill. I left in 2015. You would see a sharp rise. I arrived in 2011. There were 460 service users. I left in 2015. There were 1,800 service users. The office still since has doubled in size, doubled in budget, doubled in staffing. So that, and some Ontario colleges have reported 150 increase within a single year, from year to year. So these are the new demographics that we have to deal with. And this begs the question in terms of changing landscape, can we carry on doing what we're doing? When you see the numbers, you see the cost. An office such as the one that I was heading at McGill, the average cost was $1.2 million a year, right, to provide services. And that's money that really is thrown out the window because it's the same students going to second year and they have the same problems and so forth. And then you have new students coming in. So there's actually no sort of sustainable solution to this. It's just money and budgets that increase because the volume keeps on increasing. The staffing as well, I think at this stage, most accessibility services across Canada ideally would like double the staff that they have, but can't afford to. We're not in a sort of landscape where any service can suddenly, hope to double its staff. And so really we're finding and we're seeing bottlenecks because of the requirement for documentation, being face-to-face with an advisor, that in most campuses people have to wait and the waiting lists are getting longer and longer. And so this model is really seen as cracking at the seams and not very sustainable. So we'll come back to the sustainability part. The second argument is the explosion of diagnosis and this fragmentation of diagnosis. So really, I'm going to let Kyla talk about what she's experienced here, but if you look back 20 years, accessibility services really had three priorities: mobility impairment, visual impairment, hearing impairment, and they usually had a specialist in all three or someone who dealt with all three, and that was sufficient in terms of professional expertise to deal with most of the requirements and needs of the student population that was coming through the office. Is that still the case? So I'll let Kyla talk to you about that.
Okay. So I think the graph speaks for itself. We actually have a significant portion of our students coming through, the highest being mental health. Again, I think a lot of that because of the destigmatization and a great work that's being done through the Canadian Mental Health Association and their partnerships with post-secondary landscape around creating safe spaces to have conversations about mental health. We see students asking for help and asking for support. We also see referrals more frequent, I think, than we used to. But it does also then create a lot of opportunity to explore, well, what does it look like then to accommodate into a support? So when students are coming in for mental health is something that isn't necessarily always consistent. And so the support and services can escalate, de-escalate, or we can see students coming again and again. So we talk about the bottlenecks and the resources we have, the advising capacity we have to work sometimes with students is limited, and it's not as cut and dry, for example, with another kind of an accommodation where we know if we put alternative textbooks into place or alternative technology, assistive technology into place for a student, and we have that out of the gate, that student who's used to that assistive technology can then run with their courses, run with their program, and there is quite often onboarding throughout their experience with faculty, but it's a fairly consistent experience, whereas students with some of these other more complex presenting disabilities can require a little more support, a little more flexibility, a little more creativity, and a lot more hands-on resourcing from our area. The other one, which is interesting and a little more unique to Royal Roads than to when we were looking at the graphs that Frédéric had from McGill, would be the increase in chronic health. And that speaks a bit to our demographic. So again, we have a non-traditional age demographic. And so where are they at in their lived experience? We see a lot more persistent illness. So we have students coming in that are cancer survivors. We have students that are coming in that have chronic health related to diabetes or arthritis. And so the different kinds of experiences they have when they're in class, what does that look like when they have to sit through a 3-hour exam, or when they have to adhere to some pretty tight timeframes and timelines for assignment deliveries. So again, requires more creativity and flexibility around how do we support that student. But otherwise, I would say within Royal Roads, we're pretty, I think we're pretty consistent with what the experiences are at other post-secondary institutions for some of the other disabilities. And these terms are lifted through, these are provincial terms listed through the Ministry of Advanced Education and aligned to with what students would be applying to through student aid for funding. So visually impaired would also include low vision, chronic health, deaf and hard of hearing, learning disability. Multiple disabilities is one where it's a little bit tricky because you don't know which one they're presenting with, and quite often we'll see students with mental health also have multiple disabilities, or students with low vision might also have multiple disabilities. And then similarly, so neurological disability is the learning disability aspect. We'll see some acquired brain injury or learning disabilities will come through that, as well as others. But when we talked about that inquiry only field, we don't capture all of the students who might otherwise factor underneath a neurological disability, because sometimes we're able to provide them with support without getting that diagnosis, which is actually a beautiful thing. So when we can support a student's learning journey without having to put them through a whole bunch of cues, that we like that. We just don't have the statistic to reflect that. And then physical disability, for us here, it's small, but it is a challenge when you look around our campus and think through what is the experience being on this kind of a steep grade with some of our heritage sites and buildings. So students who have a physical disability do experience some significant challenge and require some significant support while they're here.
And so if you look across other Canadian campuses, you will definitely see a fragmentation. Fragmentation can be different. Provincial labeling and coding can be different as well, so that pie chart can look different. But what we're really seeing is an explosion of diagnosis and a real fragmentation of diagnosis. So this really questions as well the previous model that we had, when you really would have a specialist within student services that could deal with expert knowledge on that disability. Could we do that now? Well, you would need literally anything from an in-residence doctor all the way to a psychiatrist, and with everything in the middle. So that's becoming physically impossible to provide the sort of service that we've provided in the past. And yet we try, and that's what's striking at the moment. We still pretend that we're doing that, but we're not doing that. The other important thing is that it's starting a shift where I think faculty have tended to look at accessibility as being the specialist on that disability. And I think it's starting a shift where we have to often as accessibility services, acknowledge that we're not specialists anymore. This is not possible to be a specialist on all these things. Do you have a question?
There's a question from the chat. The question is, on what population size are the percentages based?
Oh, sure. So this is of those students who are registered with accessibility services. So this is of the 461 students currently registered.
So I didn't see your hand before. And so it does beg the question of who has ownership and who has the expertise to deal with this. And I think we're shifting to a discourse where I think accessibility service personnel are getting more and more comfortable about saying we don't have expert knowledge on this. And it's important for faculty because it does mean that this myth of someone on the outside that has all the solutions is eroding progressively. There isn't someone outside in accessibility that has all the solutions. And so it is pushing the burden back on faculty to think, well, I'm just as much of an expert on this as someone at accessibility. I have to also find solutions just as they have to find solutions in an area that really where we cannot be assumed to have expert knowledge on this different sort of a diagnosis. Shall we do the opposite here? Maybe I'll start here and then we'll switch over. So sustainability is one part that I was lucky, as I said, during my time at McGill, to be able to create a connection and work with the Sustainability Office. We had a project going on at the time which was called Vision 2020, and they sort of placed accessibility and universal design within that and said, really, we have to look at it in terms of sustainable change and change of culture and getting people used to seeing that just as that sustainability is not just operational, it's not just about power and refuse, but it's also about social justice and governships as well and things like this. And it is important, I think, and I know within my units, one way to really start discussions on this was to, at the annual retreat, for example, to ask people, do you see yourself doing your job the way you're doing it now in 5 years' time? And everyone would say, no, there's no way I can carry on doing that. And actually, I would say if you ask faculty in terms of accessibility, do you see yourself doing your job in the same way in 5 years' time? You'll probably get exactly the same thing. People are getting very frustrated with the amount of the heaviness of it all, the fact that they are bombarded by demands and requests for services, and they don't always know what to do. So we're seeing tension there. And sustainability often is a good way to start a conversation about change and saying, well, how do you see your job in 5 years for accessibility service personnel, for faculty, for administrators, and to start this conversation about if what we're doing now doesn't work, what is it that we're working towards? So in a way, this overlapping discourse with sustainability shifts us from being reactive, which is a lot of what we're doing at the moment, to being proactive and saying if what we do doesn't work, then what is this new imagined reality that we want to work towards? And I think it's an important pressure point, and it's where the need for solutions such as universal design really makes itself felt. And for faculty too, I like talking to people about sustainable teaching practices. So when we talk about design, we talk about curriculum development. What are sustainable practices? And often we're still not always working with sustainable practices. So to try and get people to shift to that vocabulary. Did you want to add something?
Sure. Well, just acknowledging here, we've talked a bit there about the risk of the burnout on staff, and to the point on the earlier slide with that explosion piece, we do have some pretty extreme expectations of accessibility services. There is a period too, I'm actually going to jump down to the other bullet, where we've seen rise in human rights complaints, thankfully, knock on wood, not at rural roads. But we certainly know you can look through the headlines and see what institutions like UBC and VIU have been through with respect to human rights complaints around students who have not felt accommodated or supported by their institution. And there is a fear around doing the wrong thing. And so what quite often do at least those who work in this field feel like, well, whether it's an instructor or a faculty or an associate faculty member comes in and says, well, I'm going to not touch that because I don't want to get in trouble. And so I'll just let accessibility services manage that. So that burden of being an expert in all things disability can become quite an onerous feeling and does cause a significant amount of stress. It's really not realistic. Whereas I think if we talk about or have that conversation around flipping the table and creating a space where the learning actually isn't going to create a sense of frustration or alienation or the feeling from a student about not being supported, then we diffuse things. Again, sustainable practice, we diffuse that experience right from the get-go. So we aren't having students feeling the need to complain. There's nothing to complain about. And then accessibility service providers become more advisors, and they're not having to be experts in all those different aspects or fields or areas. So again, we've been fairly lucky at Rural Roads, but we also lean really heavily on our colleagues for support resources and to try to be all things to all people, which is a challenging role to play.
Thanks, Kyla, for bringing up the human rights aspect. So in other campuses, again, Rural Roads have been very lucky in that sense. Again, that's a part that's very reactive rather than proactive. People are often settling this through mediation and through signing checks and saying, we're sorry that this happened and this is the way out. But again, how sustainable is that? When I left Quebec in 2015, I think there were 11 human rights complaints going through the tribunal. So they'd gone past mediation. They were definitely heading for court. 7 of those related to higher education. All right, so more in higher education than in employment field. So it's a reality that's becoming difficult to manage because these are very long trials, very expanded sort of procedures. And if people don't do that, then they are settling. And again, how long can we carry on doing that, right? Reacting after the facts and actually finding a pecuniary solution as opposed to being proactive. The fourth aspect, obviously, is an important one. It's this notion of shifting progressively towards a social model of disability rather than medical model of disability. So maybe I'll just introduce, for those of you who may be not familiar with the social model, just in a nutshell, and then I'll let Kyla talk about the changes that she's seeing, and then I'll talk about changes I've observed elsewhere as well. So it's something that's been in literature for quite a while. This is nothing new. People have talked about social model of disability, for 40, 50 years. But it is becoming now, it's sort of dribbling down, I think, to everyday sort of situations. And suddenly we see students who are aware of it and use that discourse and use that approach. And really, it's a model that really questions this notion of disability being inherent, being a label, being a trait that actually is attributable to people, and saying really that if you look at it from a sociological perspective, that disability really is a perception, and it's a perception that you have when your own embodiment clashes with the expectations of the environment. So that you're not disabled, but you have a feeling, a perception of disability when you're placed in an environment where suddenly the world isn't designed for you. So even if we take the example of wheelchair users, and often that's an easy one because people really see this concretely. If a person who's a wheelchair user lives in a city that is fully accessible, they can go to work with their wheelchair, they can go on leisure activities, they can do everything. Their actual experience and housing is accessible. Their experience of being disabled is actually going to be very sporadic. There will be times still in the day, but it's not a continuous identity that they will perceive all through the day. Now you put them in simply a city like Montreal, where public transport is not accessible, therefore you're not going to have the same ability to go to work, to go on your leisure activities. Suddenly, that perception of disability is going to be constant. You are going to actually have that feeling constantly. So it really sees the social model of disability sees disability as a relational, as being an interactionist model between yourself and the way the outside is designed. Now, this is important because suddenly it's a model that instead of saying you are the problem, you have disability, you are the problem, we're going to try, first of all, to fix you. So there's that whole medical model sort of vocabulary. But also it takes away the burden on the person to try and somehow fit in and find solution or find support to find solution, to saying, actually, this isn't about the person, this is about the way we design the environment. So being the way we design our buildings, our services, but also the way we design our learning. Right? So what is it that we can do differently so that people don't have this experience of disability? So before I pass on to Kyla, I'm going to use an example that I've used a lot in the past. If you take students with ADHD, for example, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, they're a good example to really see how this social model works in practice. When you work in accessibility and you register, I'm sure you'll concur, register students who have attention deficit disorder, you may see them sometimes and they may become really dependent on services, and then they may disappear for a year and a half and you don't see them again, and then suddenly they come in and go, I really need services, I need support. So why is that? Why do they sometimes need support, sometimes not need support? What are your guesses? Any guesses? The environment that they're in. So sometimes it works for them, sometimes it doesn't work for them. So yeah, and that's what we're seeing. You put them in a very sort of active learning classroom, they change roles, they really engage, they don't particularly feel disabled. Actually, you see a lot of students with attention deficit disorder sometimes outperform their peers. It's not a question of performance. But then you suddenly see them go back to a lecture theater where they're sitting down for 3 hours and it's only end of semester exam, and then they fail, or they're at risk of failing, and then they come to you and they really need modification and they need help. So that's a good example, for example, of how the social model sort of acts out and plays out in really everyday situation. The way we design things has an impact on how people can feel disabled or not disabled. And that shift is happening, I think, around us. I don't know if you want to talk to that a little bit, yeah? In your experience?
Well, only that I would say we certainly have stories to share about our students here. I think, is there a question, Sam? Teacher expectations are huge, right? Absolutely. And then the comfort level that a student can have about what their needs are. So that's one, just having an instructor who's open and willing and available to talk about what a student's learning needs are, regardless of whether or not they have that certificate of accommodation, or regardless of whether or not they're wanting to disclose what their disability is, just a conversation about what the learning needs are. And then to our colleagues in CTET who talk about this all the time, looking at different ways to provide assessment, looking at different ways to focus on what the learning outcomes are, as opposed to the more traditional model where a student's expected to just come in, sit, absorb, and reiterate or regurgitate, which works very, very well for some students still, although I would say my colleagues in CTEC would say we shouldn't be encouraging that approach to learning. But there are definitely students we have seen thrive, particularly in our learning model when think about our Bachelor of Commerce students with the team-based learning and the entrepreneurial thinking. You can get some really good creative thinkers that can come in and say, like for our mid-career professionals, wow, I did not do well in high school. I come to this learning model and all of a sudden I thought I was, I actually thought I wasn't intelligent until I came here and realized that I am and I can thrive. And they're thriving because they're in an environment where they can showcase their skills and they can, really, in a sense, really shine. So being open and considerate of what different types of ways, methods for assessment and opportunities for learning that we can promote definitely will decrease stress. Because then you'll see some of those students that then if they have higher levels of ADHD, well, where else will that maybe play out in areas of mental health? So in terms of thinking of it from an open and inclusive mental health perspective as well, anything we can do that can allow students to just enjoy the learning process and feel good about the learning process as opposed to feel trepidation, fear, and anxiety around the learning process, I think will create a more open and sustainable learning environment for all of us. So definitely, I know you've got a couple slides coming, but the Albert Einstein quote too that I think many of us are familiar with, everyone's a genius, but if you expect a fish to ride a bicycle, right, he will always think that he is stupid. So.
Yeah, we had a few cartoons for you. I think you might stay on because we're talking about student voice, so you'll probably be the first person to talk about that. But this one, if you, we read it for you, it's too small font, but he's climbing stairs, and please could you shovel the ramp? All these other kids are waiting for to use the stairs, so I'll do the shoveling first, and then I'll get to the ramp, right? Mm-hmm. The notion that if you shovel the ramp, everyone could actually get through that. So this notion of inherent flexibility. And this one's really popular too, right? The fact that we're sometimes so focused on retrofitting, so that would be where accommodation, accessibility services are at the moment, but if you design a different way, sometimes you skip that step altogether. You don't actually need to do any retrofitting or go through that. That's a really popular cartoon that sort of has gone viral. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to talk about the fifth factor in this changing landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I go back? Another example we've seen too within our internationalization of campuses, where we've seen you have a student maybe who's hard of hearing or has a visual impairment, and so creating different modalities by creating live captioning in courses or recorded transcripts of lectures or online discussions. We've had feedback then from other students who have come and said, wow, feel so lucky to have been in this class where this transcript was offered or provided, because it makes my learning richer or deeper or helps me out too. So just thinking about the fact that kind of model of learning and design, you think you're doing it for one student, turns out you're doing it for all. Yes, again, speaking to the experience of our students and student voice, again, transitions, times have changed. So students coming through K-12 now across the country quite often have a language and an understanding of their learning style. So they're coming with expectations. We've had a lot of conversations about what millennials are like in the classroom, in the workplace, right? They have a voice and they have expectations of us, and they are looking for opportunities where they will be able to share their voice, their perspective, their opinion, and be included and be welcomed for it. So we have students walking into our accessibility services office saying, well, yeah, no, they've got my file at Camosun, or here's what I've got from my high school, and this is what I received. This is the support that I received. What are you going to do for me here? What's my experience look like here? And so I think Royal Roads, we're very lucky, we're very creative, and again, coming from that entrepreneurial space and identity, but there's definitely a post-secondary experience. There's a disconnect. I would say, I'm going to look to Frédéric, say there's a pretty significant disconnect between K through 12 and post-secondary writ large. And so that wraparound support that exists in K through 12, there's almost been this, I don't know, this expectation in the post-secondary system that, well, here's where you come and you really show your grit. And so we don't provide the wraparound support historically in the post-secondary system. Come and prove yourself and prove your worth being part of us, as opposed to, you know what do we really need to be doing to making sure that this experience works for the people it serves and the students that join us. So there is an increased expectation now from students coming through. And again, what's interesting is some of the intergenerational learning that's happening when students, again, are coming through and sharing their experiences. Our demographic of older, more mature students who are the parents are also saying, hey, what's happening? And I have expectations too. So they are becoming their own advocates. They're asking questions that we didn't have or weren't receiving years ago. They're asking that of instructors. They're asking that of curriculum designers. And that idea that there's now a clash of cultures being observed on course where the discourse isn't adequately addressed. So again, we're seeing more voice from students demanding a different kind of a learning experience, rather than I can think of generations of us that just took our grade and accepted it and didn't even do a grade appeal. Well, how many, right? We have a different kind of a student body now that has different kinds of expectations.
Thanks, Kyla. I'm glad you touched on this difference between K-12 and the post-secondary sector. So I wrote a paper a while back in Learning Landscape, I think in Quebec, and they specifically asked for a piece on this, on the difference between approaches to K-12 and to higher ed. And really my view is that as much as you will see we focus on inclusion in K-12, we focus on a human rights approach in higher ed. So we say we have, and the human rights approach is back to that second, the boxes to help the kids see over the fence. It's still retrofitting because people are, the human rights legislative approach under the charter is saying, well, if there's discrimination, you have to fix it, but you have to fix it through accommodation. You have to, take steps so that the person is helped through that discriminatory process. It doesn't actually go all the way to saying you have to change the reason why that discrimination happened in the first place. So we're seeing a lot of students arrive with this, clear understanding of the values of inclusion, social inclusion. With everything that it brings, being in the same room and doing things with others and having exactly access to the same thing as others. And then they shift to this environment where we'll tell them, well, you have equal rights, but you may have to go somewhere else to get them, right? You're not going to be staying in the room. And that's creating more and more problems. And students are being more and more eloquent about the fact that that's not what they see as being inclusion. So I'll give you a few anecdotal sort of examples of things I've encountered. For example, my last year at McGill, there was a student. So McGill still has finals and still has finals in a gym with 800 people. So definitely people who have access to disability services usually opt to do that elsewhere because it's difficult to provide in an auditorium of 800 people. But the student had a vision impairment and she wanted enlarged text. And she said, I don't want to go to a separate rooms. I want to sit with my peers. I want enlarged text in the auditorium. Well, you can try that in a traditional university. It ruffles all the feathers. No. There were no's all the way up. Till she went to the president of the university and said, I will not settle for anything less. All I want is enlarged text. I will sit my exam with everyone else, try and make this a point, and I will try and make a point too. And the president had to back down and say, actually, we'll do that. There's no reason why we can't bring you enlarged text to the auditorium itself. So you're seeing that more and more. I think students are really querying this notion of why do I have to go to a separate place? Why do I have to take exam in a separate building? Why do I have to be separated from my peers because I'm getting special alternate format? Why can that not be done in the classroom itself? And why can we not differentiate? They actually understand the word, they understand concept. Why can instruction not be differentiated within the classroom itself? Often I'll give you another example of a case I was involved in where an instructor was doing, a 15-minute quiz and students had extra time. So try and see what extra time can mean in terms of 15-minute quiz. We're not talking, much time. And the instructor insisted that the students should go to accessibility to have the extra time. This meant that they had to walk across campus to go and take 15-minute test to have 6 more minutes to then come back to their class, losing half an hour of instruction. And again, there was a lot of voice from students saying this is irrational, how can this be inclusion? And why do you make me go somewhere else to have an extra 6 minutes? Why can this not be done in the class? So we're seeing more and more of these examples. And I think there's been so far in many campuses a desire to just quell it and pretend it's going to go away. I think it's not going to go away. I think that voice is louder and louder, and it's creating a culture clash, and it's going to be important for this whole system not to break down, that we start listening and that we find ways to hear the expectation that students have in this regard. Mm-hmm. So I hope we haven't given you too much of a grim sort of view of the landscape, but I think it's important to start there so that you see, if you talk about solutions without showing people why it's not working, people are more resistant to change. I think once you take the time to really let all this sink in, you realize there's a need for something else. And one of the solutions is universal design for learning. There are others, I think, but it's one that suddenly comes to mind, and that I would argue addresses a lot of these issues. So how do you define it? Because universal design for learning is very difficult to define, and the whole sort of argument can start about, well, how do you frame it? How do you define it? How do what terminology do you use? So we'd work, when I was in McGill, we worked a lot to trying to find a simple solution. And we had come up with something that said it is a sustainable model for managing disabilities on campus. And that's really what it is. And that translates the social model of disability, because that's what it does. In everyday discourse, it places the burden back on the instructor to be a designer of the experience and to design in a way that's more inclusive, so that we don't have to rely on retrofitting. Did you want to add something there? No? Yeah. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a look at universal design. The point of today wasn't really to spend too much time looking at universal design, but just to see in what respect it sort of addresses all the concerns that we've looked at before. So I stole this a long time ago from the head, but it's a really sort of useful set of slides, I find. So because it puts side to side, the retrofitting, the traditional approach. You could also say medical model. And on the other side, universal design, which you could also say social model approach. So on this side, I see access is a problem with the individual, right? We're saying you have disability, you need to disclose, you need this documentation. On the other side, in this new way of looking at things, access is a problem stemming from the environment. Therefore, the solutions need to come from the campus, from the classroom, from the instructor. On the old approach, access is achieved through accommodation and retrofitting. In the new approach, system environment is designed to the greatest extent possible to be usable by all. Obviously, there's some qualification there, into the greatest extent as possible. I think if even through this lens, we're not saying that there will be no future use for disability service providers. There will always be extreme case students that have very complex and complicated sort of diagnoses that require very specific things. But it may mean that we can reduce drastically the amount of students that rely on accessibility, and that most requests are actually managed internally in the classroom. In the old model, access was retroactive. This is really important. And now access becomes proactive. It's really in the design phase. In the old model, access was specialized. We talked about diagnosis and having experts at hand. But in the new model, access is inclusive. I'll just pause there for a minute, but I think as a faculty too, I'm able to wear these two hats, and I think it's really re-empowering when suddenly you don't have to rely on someone, this mythical person with accessibility that has all the solutions, and you can actually step back and say, hang on, there's some things I can do. I have power here that I can design differently. I can rethink my form of assessment. I can take some time to redesign my delivery in the classroom. And I think my experience has been that people, when they go through that process, actually feel, really empowered. They feel less frustration because suddenly they are able to find solutions. Some of the solutions that they have in the classroom. And in the old model, access was consumable, and in the new model, access is sustainable. Something which I've been able to see when I'm supporting faculty at McGill is people coming back to us with solutions that they had adopted and saying, I want to give you some feedback about, what has worked. And one example I want to give you, because I think it's always useful to give some sort of concrete example. A big problem in higher ed, for example, are deadlines, right? People have deadlines and they have to submit by such and such date. And so when you start talking to faculty and say, well, how would you redesign this notion of deadlines, within a universal design model? We actually had faculty who came up with solutions and then brought it to us at Accessibility and said, this is what I've tried and this really works. And they would, for example, have banks of grace days. So when they start a course, they would put in their syllabus, you have 6 days of grace period. So you still have deadlines, but they would say you have 6 days, floating days. You can not use them. You can use them if you wish. You can use some of these days. You can spread them out. You can use all of them for the same paper. You are completely accountable, but you have this bank of days there that you can use if you require it for your health, for whatever's going on. And faculties who, we then had little videos and we modeled this for other instructors, and people would come back and say, it's amazing in terms of sustainability, the amount of sort of frustration that I've been able to just, do away with, because I would have to be engaging with people in all this intrusive conversation of why is it not in, what do you need, how many days do you need, and that now I'm able to not have these conversations and focus on the things that are really important to me in the relationship with the students, and they can self-manage with this tool that I've sort of embedded into my course. And it's there, it's also sustainable in the sense that once you add it to your toolbox, it's in your course sort of outline, it's there, it's the way you function, and then you don't even have to think about it. You can enrich it further, you can add different things, but that can stay in sort of the basis of what you have. Yeah?
Yeah.
You want to?
Sure, I can think of a couple examples. So I also just want to speak to it from the very practical administrative experience we have here at Royal Road. So we have a system where a student will register with accessibility services and we generate a certificate of accommodations. And because we have a cohort model and we try to be student-centered, we then take the onus off the student, where at another institution the student would then be responsible for taking this around to other instructors. We actually do that for the students. So we work with program offices, and program offices then for every upcoming class with a new instructor identify who is in that class that has accommodations, what are the separate accommodation letters I need to do, and they send that package off to an instructor. So as a new instructor coming in, you might have 35 or 36 students in your class, and anywhere between 4 to 6 to 8 of those students might have accommodations. So then as an instructor, I've got to know what is Bill and Sam and Tom and Ted and Sally, what are all of their specific accommodations, who talks to who first? Am I going to talk to them first? Are they going to talk to me first? How do we speak through this? How do I remember which one has how many extra time, which one requires alternate text, which one? Universal design takes all of that individual conversation away, and that idea of time saving and administrative saving and sustainability, it becomes a much easier process where the students themselves aren't having to worry or increase their anxiety level about engaging in conversations or advocating constantly for what they need. And the instructor doesn't have to worry about that point about being intrusive because it's simply just there, which is lovely, and time saving. But then the other piece, again, I'm reiterating what's been shared, is that the benefit actually doesn't just benefit Tommy and Sally and Ted, it benefits absolutely every student in the class. So the students that are getting that bank of time are also the students that had an unforeseen sick parent or sick child, right? So it just creates a learning environment that is good for all of our students, not just the students with a disability. So really, I think definitely really important. And there was another example too of in the MBA program, they have a timed exam for finance. They have to go in during a certain period of time. The instructor last year took that time frame away and said, okay, you have between Monday and Sunday to write the exam. So it started on a Monday, I think closed on a Sunday. Once you start the exam will be timed for students so this is a bit of a flex, right? But for students that had extra time, they were given extra time onto that, but you can pick any time you want to write that exam. And I believe you could stop and start. So you had X amount of time at the exam, but the freedom of having to be available Tuesday night from 4 to 7 Pacific time, whatever, the restriction was lifted, and it didn't just benefit the students that required accommodation, it actually benefited every student. So we were able to have conversations with students who were registered with accessibility to say, no, you don't need to worry. He's actually leveled the playing field. Like he's actually opened up the doors and leveled the playing field so any student can build this exam into their experience, which was just great for all students, not just for the students that had accommodations.
Thanks, Kyla. I'll just add a little bit to that before we move to the next slide. It's something I think that's become really relevant now that if we start going through this process and looking at ourselves as designers of a learning experience, to really look at, as you said, the number of students and groups that it can benefit. And so far, the work around universal design is really focused on disability, but it's starting to change. And certainly when you look at international students, so I published a chapter in a book last, I think a couple of months back, which really focused on that and how to use universal design to create inclusive provisions for international students. So I was running a stream of masters that was 100% international students and was finding quite a lot of ease in doing that when I had colleagues who were really frustrated. And really what I was using was actually everything I'd taken and imported from disability, and I was using UDL, and that worked perfectly well for a cohort that was entirely international. If you think about it, and I'll let you in your own time go through all this process, when you create that flexibility, well, it's very beneficial to students who are second language learners and are coming to a new country. But when I was at McGill as well, we did a lot of work with First People's House, and we were getting a lot of feedback that it was, very beneficial for Indigenous students as well. I'll give you an example. For example, when we talk about, and I'll start with the next slide, which are the general principles of universal design. But when we look, for example, at the second principle, offering multiple means of action and expression, so when we try and have more flexibility in the way we are sort of accepting information from students or their voice or their exam, if it's assessment, that leads in one particular area, for example, the contribution mark. When you have in class contribution and instructors putting 10, 15% for contribution, we said, well, you could create a little bit of flexibility, because asking people to raise their hand and be vocal in a classroom can be really daunting if you have mental health illness, for example, or something like that. Anxiety, there may be lots of reasons why you have something to contribute, but you don't want to be in the spotlight in a lecture hall of 30 or even more people. And when instructors tried and started this, they said, what I noticed first is Indigenous students within my classroom that were very, very quiet in the classroom and would not contribute orally were giving really, really rich contributions when I created an online chat, because suddenly there wasn't that sort of social focus and the fact that they had to take the spotlight and be seen. So I think there's more and more development about all the different ways that it serves, different diverse learners. And this is really important, because I think a resistance to change on campuses has been the fact that we've said, it's only disability, right? What's the max people that this can affect? Well, already, University of Brighton in the UK, I think has 50,000 students. 10% of the campus is registered with accessibility services. 10%, 5,000 students. Now they've gone through all the process: diagnosis, documentation, come in, see. There's probably other people who are still floating, but 10%. So when people ask me what's the ceiling, well, it's somewhere up there, right? 10 to 15% of students who may require that. If you add to that international students, on my previous campus at UPI, 26% of students were international. Right? When you put 15%, 10%, 26%, you add that, you add indigenous students, well, you're not talking about a minority discourse anymore. You're actually talking about something that affects probably half of our our learner population. So it is now a majority discourse, I would argue, and should no longer be seen as a minority discourse. Did you want to? No? Okay.
I would think we're the same. Yeah.
We wanted to put the slide up. This is the slide that comes from CAST about the three principles. All I would say to that is, it's important, I think, with Universal Design for Learning to look at the spirit of the model and not the letter of the model. Even if David Rose, who created the model sort of with CAST, keeps arguing, don't take this literally, don't go through all the categories. This is just an example of what you could do with it. It's a lens on practice. That's all it is. It's making you think as a designer in terms of 3 dimensions of your teaching and learning. And then the reflection is yours, depending what you teach, depending what grade level, what sort of, if you're undergrad or graduate, depending what discipline you are. If you're in a lab, it might be different than if you're in a lecture hall. That reflection has to be your own. You have to own that. It just gives you those 3 sort of lenses that you can start unpacking your practices and getting out of your zone of comfort and saying, okay, I could design things differently. I could actually add some flexibility here in my practices. I think we have about 5 minutes. I just wanted to touch on this very quickly. Some of the advantages when you talk to faculty. Obviously, if you are, for example, if someone is contemplating the US for career or for work, it's becoming a prevalent discourse now in the US in higher ed. So there's some advantages to getting familiar with it, because definitely it's a common discourse, common dialogue with a lot of people. Even within Canada, we're hopeful that it's spreading. And as some of you probably know, we are organizing a conference here. It's the 3rd Canadian conference on UDL, which will happen in October. The point is to actually make sure that all these different sort of initiatives that are happening across the country actually are coming together, and that we're sharing this experience, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. There's a momentous sort of development of UDL across Canada. The problem, as you know, is that education is provincial, and we're not always great as Canadians at sharing what we're doing, across sort of provincial boundaries. But it's definitely there, and we've seen in the last 10 years really grown significantly. I would argue, and we have Sophie here, but that the point of UDL is really also that it unpacks really rich conversations about pedagogy. And often it's not the solution in itself, but once you start adopting that lens, it opens a lot of dialogues around pedagogy. I think we're very lucky at Royal Roads, for example, that we have a very clear alignment with program outcomes, and we've done all that work. Often when you're on other campuses, that work has not been done. And when you start talking about UDL or accessibility, very quickly, you see the discourse shifting to, well, what is it actually that we're trying to teach and what are our outcomes? And often that outcome analysis has not been done, and it pushes people to say, well, we need to do that because we can't talk about accessibility and we can't talk about UDL without that essential sort of pedagogical reflection having gone on. And the last point, again, the fact that, people who try it find that it really reduces, first of all, the paperwork, the red tape, all these processes, this intrusive discussion with students, changes the nature of their relationship with students, changing the nature of their relationship with accessibility, because it becomes really a facilitator then rather than someone that you rely on for that information. And I think it has the potential to change people's sort of job satisfaction and the way they sort of, again, look at their teaching practice as being sustainable. Yeah. Do you want a few closing words?
Sure. Well, just that, again, I think it pulls us all into the conversation together, students and faculty and curriculum designers, and helps. There is already enough of the power imbalance for students coming into a classroom and learning environment that it really just helps de-escalate any adversarial position that they might be in to a student that's really feeling that they need to advocate for something, as opposed to a student who can come in and just enjoy the learning experience, which just makes it that much more enjoyable for everyone, the faculty included.
So we probably have a couple of minutes for questions if there are questions. I don't know if there's anyone online or here. While we wait, just remind you we have the conference coming up. This was part of the point of doing the session today and reminding people where this fits in. And I think it's really useful because sometimes we jump into the whole discourse on UDL, but we need to go back to explain to people where it fits in. And I hope today we've been able to show you that our current practices are really cracking at the seams, that we can't really carry on doing what we're doing, and therefore there is an imperative need for change. And that's where UDL would fit in, that if we need to change, well, we have to start looking at solutions. You had a question?
Can you just say out loud the URL for this?
Yeah, so it's udlcanada.ca. That's right, for www.udlcanada.ca. Okay, well, if there are no other questions. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Frédéric and Kyla, I was just going to, and Samantha and everyone was just going to say thank you for speaking about this and providing an opportunity that, as someone who's more focused on the employment experience here at Royal Roads, but the impacts of our colleagues, and to be mindful of this going into how we can take the learning that you're experiencing within academia and bring it into the lived experience for all of us here in employment as well. When we look at equity, diversity, and inclusion and the work that we're just starting there, it's I appreciate the lens that this is providing.
Thank you. Yeah, and definitely, and I think it's a model that works well for any interaction between, certainly in terms of service providers. So it does work with employment, it works within student services. When I left McGill, we were trying to encourage people to use it in residence, in libraries, and people I think are finding it really useful because, again, that lens, even if it's not a classroom, you are still interacting with people and you can create that flexibility in the way you expect things from them, the way you provide things to them, and the way you're trying to engage them, definitely. Absolutely. Well, and I would, as a closing remark, I would say as well, what's interesting, and in my experience, I don't know, Kyla, if you have the same, but in my experience when I was in McGill, certainly I got more and more dragged into conversation with qualifying professional bodies, Faculty of Medicine, Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Nurses, who would say, okay, you're doing this on campus, can you come and talk to us about how we would do this in terms of qualifications, and I think it's exciting to see that it is working there as well, and people are getting more and more interested in universal design for learning in those contexts, and to rethink things like licenses, professional licenses, and where can we introduce that flexibility, and how's the world changing, and we have to catch up, basically. So it's useful in all these dimensions as well. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you. Spot on time. Thanks very much.